This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black Studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Courtney Baker, who teaches in the Department of English at the University of California, Riverside. Along with numerous articles in public and scholarly venues on art and the aesthetic, she is the author of Humane Insight, looking at images of African American suffering and death from 2015. In a previous position, she was the co-founder and chair of the Department of Black Studies at Occidental College. In this conversation, we discuss the place of art and aesthetic inquiry in Black studies, the role of tradition in building knowledge in Black study, and the significance of the field for Black liberation struggle. Good afternoon, Courtney. How are you today?
I am well. How are you?
I'm not too bad. It's Friday. As we were talking beforehand, it's always good to wrap up, in this case, a very strange week, but every week has been strange in the last month. But I've been really looking forward to this conversation. So it's a great way for me to wrap up the week and get you on the podcast. I really love your work. I think you have a lot of really interesting things to say about literary studies, Black studies, area studies. And so having you on the podcast and as part of this series is a real treat. So I just wanted to say that and thank you for making the time and putting in the thoughtfulness for this.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I've been looking forward to this too. I've been kind of committed to Black study for a while now, in some sense, my entire life. So, in one way or the other. So it's great to have this opportunity to have a conversation that I think is particularly urgent these days.
It is particularly urgent, and part of what motivated, I think, the series, to start this project for me and my collaborator Ashley was this sense that we really don't sit down and talk about Black studies and Black studies. We do our research and we contribute, but having a chance to talk about the field and visions of the field and critiques, but also compliments. So I'm really happy that you made the time and really look forward to hearing about your research and how you understand the field. But starting out with what you sort of indicated there, right? You said Black study has been a part of you for your whole life. And I wanted to ask you, to start, what drew you to Black study and to the field of Black studies? And always for me, a really interesting component of that is what sustains you in relation to this kind of work.
Those are wonderful questions. I suppose I would say I was unintentionally involved in Black study throughout my entire life, in the sense that I I am of the generation that moved into the suburbs. My mother grew up in Harlem. My father grew up in Southern Virginia, so both specifically Black environments, and I grew up with both of them in New Jersey suburbs. Not an exceptionally or in any way predominantly Black community, but so those connections to my ancestors, to my family members, family visits and vacations, going into New York, which was not so far away, really brought me into an awareness of what really Black culture and society looked like beyond just the parameters of mine or even my parents' existence. So, without giving you a kind of Tristram Shandy's type overview beginning from birth or conception, I'll say that I
You have not had
became
Black studies as conception story, so that would be new ground.
that would, yeah, maybe we need that work. But I'm not going to offer it here. I'm going to give you my my very intentional and I'll say academic project, which I would say began as perhaps most journeys into higher education do in college, to a certain extent before then, but um, not within the formal classroom within elementary or primary or secondary school. But by the time I was in college, I knew I was interested in issues of justice. So that was the 90s, the coming out of the Reagan years, the Bush years, transitioning into the Clinton years. And I had already gotten a sense of significant shifts in the United States, in the world more generally, but in terms of politics. And I I I guess I found my voice. I was interested in inequities, particularly gender inequities. And so my undergraduate degree is in women's studies. But I was also especially captivated, in particular, by the study of media, and in particular, the work of Stuart Hall and other folks of color who were working in film and media. And what that authorized for me was an appreciation that the objects, the people, the communities, the cultures that are really close to me are themselves worthy of study. That it wasn't just about learning to be a very particular version of a scholar that is enshrined um, by a very narrow perspective of who the regular scholar is. So I went to Harvard, and you can probably imagine what the Harvard image of the scholar looks like, right? Predictably white, predictably male, and so that having courses and faculty who recognize and authorize, look, the movies that you are watching now, the music that you're listening to now, the political movements that are happening now, as well as the historical investigations into how we got to this point in terms of a racial politics and a racialized nation, are important and are not only worthy of study, but require a certain amount of rigor. And I was really enticed by the kind of demands and challenges, which I would now say, those challenges, those kind of mystifications and obfuscations about what in particular Blackness means, was by design. And so it requires some quite intensive study. And yeah, I was excited to participate in it.
Yeah, no, I'm reminded of, oh geez, I was trying to think who, I think it was Courtney Terry. Courtney Terry's podcast, where she had this phrase that stuck with me. She said rigorous care.
Hmm.
And so I was just really struck where you said that, these things that surrounded you, the demand was not that they were worthy of study, but that they were worthy of rigorous study. I love that. Yeah. How did that carry over into graduate study? I'm curious.
Sure. So I graduated from the lit program at Duke, which was an intentionally interdisciplinary program. So it was helmed by Fred Jameson, and it was a space where one could study film critically, not so much the production side. And I knew that that was what I wanted to do. And Duke also had and has a tremendous faculty working in African and African American studies. Um, yeah, and so there I was I was pushed to think about a longer lineage of aesthetics and aesthetic criticism in the mode of Jameson. And while initially that chafed somewhat, I've increasingly become really fascinated by the ways in which these theories of aesthetics that have been authorized by and enshrined within the Western Academy are, whether they acknowledge it or not, are founded upon an idea of Blackness. So I also happened to be at Duke at the time where there were a number of Black women scholars who were my colleagues and graduate students who were coming up. And so these conversations around any object that we were encountering or any kind of theoretical modality that we were encountering was being shaped by conversations amongst Black women, Rebecca Wanzo, Mendi Opadike, Evie Shockley, Erica Edwards. So we were having these conversations and thinking about, our positionalities in relation to this. And we also had the great fortune of studying under folks like Carla Holloway and Juanita Lubiano and Mark Anthony Neal and many other folks.
Yeah, that's quite a series of names you were able to say. Not a bad cohort, to put it lightly. Yeah, and I'm curious. This is knowing your work, and I have a chance to talk about it in a moment. But thinking sort of from that context and the way these cultural objects, aesthetic objects, aesthetic events, and so forth, the way they were sort of your introductory path into Black studies, I'm curious how the field, what portrait of the field, what a portrait of the field looks like for you. And I specifically, I guess, want to ask this in the context of its origins, which was, fraught from the beginning, or at least tense from the beginning, right? The demand for a place to study the Black intellectual and expressive traditions, right? That disciplines had not done this, and so Black studies was going to be that place that transformed our sense of intellectual life. But it was also a moment of Black liberation struggle really breaking so many of those boundaries between study and activism, between communities and campuses, between intellectual work and political struggle. And I think that as many decades that have passed since the origin of the field, I think that tension is still kind of there with us, about what is Black studies, what is its ultimate commitment. And so I guess asking you about your to describe your portrait of the field of Black studies, how you think about it and how you imagine its possibilities. I'm asking also in relation to this tension, this whatever you want to call it at its origin point.
Sure. I think I'm a case study in being a lifelong learner, or hopefully of the benefit of considering oneself to be a perpetual student, in addition to being a professor. So to be honest, I don't really think I was as intentional as I am now about considering the curriculum and the real necessity, and the political origins of Black study until I was tasked with rejuvenating Africana studies at Connecticut College and then building the Black Studies program, which is now a department at Occidental College. And that warranted looking into really what best served our students now, and also getting a clearer sense of the work that Black Studies has continued to do, including its, I may say, fraught or contentious origins, but its roots in activism. So it was at Connecticut College. My colleague, Monique Badasse, really emphasized that Black studies, as distinct from African American studies, as distinct from Africana studies, and also as distinct perhaps from African American studies, that comes from a very particular moment, that it's connected to advocacy. It's also connected to a conceptualization of Black that is political and politicized, that term Black as a racial and cultural and even nationalistic signifier is a reclamation of a term that was historically being used as a slur. So I say and I remind my students of the significance of James Brown saying, "Say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud," in a moment when the lingua franca was Negro. So the assertion of Blackness and is matched, as I've learned in my own study of the history and evolutions of Black studies, by a recognition that Blackness is the line that indicates not just a racial formation, but the things that are degraded and are deliberately and historically have been left out of the academy and deemed exclusively to be extractable objects of study, which includes ideas as well as people. So I see the project of Black Studies as in some ways inherently against some of the foundational principles of the university, particularly the boundary that it seeks to draw between those who are within the academy and those without. And San Francisco State, their advocacy, being the first Black Studies department in the United States, really makes that clear, that they were really invested in bringing in community, in understanding and appreciating, as Tony Caden Barr says, that if a community doesn't know something and only one person knows something, that isn't knowledge. That's just really selfish. That's just information.
Yeah, no, this is fantastic. Thank you for that. I think I really like that way of thinking about it, the relationship to origins. And, I'm also struck in a lot of these conversations, just all of these conversations on the podcast, how in 2025, it feels strange to think about intellectual life somehow being outside political conflict. I was saying talking with someone recently about, this series, and, this is either a documentation of what used to be Black studies, right? Because the very thinking of the kinds of stuff that we do is at stake, or it could be, the moment that Black studies fights its way through a crisis. But to your point, it's the fact that it is in the, sort of in the space that it is now, that our field is under such scrutiny and possibly up for elimination and withdrawal of funds and all of those governmental dramatics. I mean, it does have a relationship to that, exactly what you were saying, this understanding that actually intellectual life and political activity goes so deeply hand in hand at its origins. And measuring ourselves to that, I think, is one thing, but also understanding that just the simple fact of Black studies is already such a political intervention. It's something that I think we need to take really seriously and rally around. So not that I'm making this all of a sudden my answer, but I responding to so much of what you said, which I thought was just really wonderfully put.
Yeah, I mean, I think politics emerges in the face of Black presence, right? So I think part of the pushback on DEI, which is a code, which I've seen folks elsewhere say, you can't grieve what you never asked for and didn't receive, is that
that's bleak and really, really
it's bleak, but I feel like it's also freeing. That was Crown Magazine that used that, but it's freeing because it affirms that that politics is also code for, I don't want to talk about race. I don't want to talk about Blackness. So if Blackness is always a disruption to some norm, then the norm is not the norm. And we have to do the work to recalibrate, to understand what is being passed off as natural and normal is in significant part, a consequence of figuring Black people, Black culture, the definition, and I mean the constitutional definition in the actual Constitution, in laws, in jurisprudence, of Blackness as anomalous. It's not anomalous. It's foundational.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. Thank you. And I think this, it might be a little bit of a rough transition, but I also think like deeply continuous transition to ask you about your own work, which I really love. By the way, this,
Thank you.
it's so engaged with so many things that I write on and care about. So I really, your work has got a mix of aesthetics, cultural studies, literary and critical theory. We'll have a chance. I want to ask you about the Duke program in a moment, but is really in some ways the best of what I think of the Duke program. But that collage of approaches that you have just have generated so many really potent insights for the field of Black studies. And I'm interested to hear you reflect on your work in relation to the history of Black studies, how you see it fitting in, how it's part of the tradition, but also what boundaries do you think it pushes or new horizons do you think it opens up?
Thank you. It's I my book came out 10 years ago, and so it's been such a sea change since then. I was just realizing I was using microfiche when I was doing research. Like the digitization.
These are crazy paths to go down, what we use to write our books and what the next project uses. Yeah.
But it's really, it's really important too. And I'm not saying that just to highlight my work, but the investments and conversations around the archive and accessing the archive and paying attention to the past is really a front of mind, I think, for a lot of folks who are engaged in Black studies. I say that also to say I do think I'm learning and increasingly appreciating what I was trying to do. On some level, I felt just called. I know that's really woo-woo, but it felt like really important work to look straight into the most, not just critically complex, but also emotionally complex thing I could think of. I wanted to be of service. I wanted to be of service. And to your earlier point, without necessarily having the language for it, I think I wanted to restore care and respect to not only the people who were brutalized. So if folks don't know, my book examines the phenomenon and the activism around imagery and in-person and visual encounters with brutalized Black bodies from 1834, so the slavery period, just leading into abolition and into the cessation or basically the removal of slavery and pushing it into the prison systems, up to Katrina and the devastations and the displacements and the rhetoric and discourse around Black life during that time. So this was also on the precipice of the discourse around Black Lives Matter, which I still think is a phenomenal declaration just as a sentence. And I'm really interested, you bring up Duke, right? I'm really interested in that post-structuralist angle. I'm really interested in the way that language and signs and symbols create our reality. I know that Blackness isn't real, but it is real. It has real effects and it really impacts people's lives. So another thing that I was really clear on when I was starting that book, which started as the dissertation while I was in graduate school, and September 11th occurred. I'm from New Jersey, commuted into New York. I had family in the city at that time, and I was bereft. And I also found that I couldn't stop watching the images of disaster and of human lives disappearing before my eyes. And I also recognized that while I was drawn to that, to try to understand something, it seemed like the most important thing to understand what was happening, that folks weren't dying in vain. I also understood that I was trying to turn away from the photograph of Emmett Till that Mamie Till, his mother, had deliberately presented to the world and to me. So I really wanted to sit with that. And this is also a moment when we started talking about visual studies more broadly, not in exclusive silos of art history, of film studies, or photography studies, but thinking broadly. So that led me to a kind of phenomenological approach to the image that I found supported in a lot of theoretical works, and also discarded by a lot of theoretical works, like the work of Hegel. But I have often said, and I will continue to say, that Mamie Till Mobley was my teacher. And she was a genius, and not only a political genius in the sense of figuring out, with support, really crucial activism that some have argued inaugurated the 20th century civil rights movement in the United States, but also the incredible emotional intelligence. And that emotional intelligence, the intelligence of a mother, of a woman for a child, and for Blackness, and an understanding of nation, and an understanding of visibility, and a refusal of shame, is an extraordinary, it's an extraordinary wisdom that I thought just underscored how impoverished Hegel is, right? These ideas of that encountering another person leads to wanting to destroy them. Where, as Toni Morrison might say, who misraised you? So I really wanted to kind of do the thing in some sense that Patricia Hill Collins acknowledges, which is recognizing genius, Black genius that exists outside of the academy and that is necessarily exiled from the academy. So, and I also really wanted to explore how, and to chart without judgment, importantly, how activists like Ida B. Wells were tracking and engaging in acts of care in order to restore and assert Black dignity in the face of the most degrading experiences, and to try to figure out also what legacies that left. And and also the degree to which the concept of humanity can or still does or does not serve us. It was ambitious.
I mean, there's so much in that. It's just wonderfully put. This podcast conversation alone is worth it for that articulation of how to think about Mamie Till as wisdom and thought, as an event of thinking and wisdom. So I absolutely love that. And, it underscores, not to turn this into a, thing about me and you and me reading your work, but, one of the things that has motivated my own work, for, I'll count the years, but like 3 decades, is the opening panel of Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, which is, of course, a film of witness, a documentary of witness to the Holocaust that shows no bodies. But it says, the opening panel says, it's a quote from Isaiah, it says, "I will give them an everlasting name." And it's sort of, what does it mean to give a name to something? Right. And that sense of intellectual work, of wisdom, of courage, of thoughtfulness, while also understanding all those questions of care and ethics around that representation. And Katrina was, for what it's worth, was really formative for me too. We were talking beforehand, I teach a class on Spike Lee every couple of years, and we talk about When the Levees Broke, and, what he does in that, as well as Four Little Girls, his 2 main documentary projects, what he does with bodies, and how to do that in cinema, but also how to do it in our own language. I find that, I don't know how you find it in the classroom, but I find students are extremely attentive to this. This is not something I have to sort of draw them into, the sort of ethics of putting Black death on the screen, or even putting it in words.
Yeah, I find students to be the students I've encountered, and it's not always self-selecting because I am teaching courses that aren't necessary sometimes that aren't conspicuously about Black studies, but they're all interested in justice and how to ethically engage as a scholar researcher. And I think especially now that I'm teaching, excuse me, at an institution that is a Hispanic serving institution that has a substantial proportion of first generation students who really kind of appreciate and recognize and are very aware that they're in an institution that their parents, their forebears, and many of their members of their immediate community are not, that they're not interested in leaving folks behind and just surpassing them.
Mhm.
And I I'm really kind of I'm definitely grateful to them and kind of relieved. And it also has really helped me to appreciate what what it can be to do Black studies work within the academy. I mean, we could have a whole other conversation about higher education and its consternations now and its shifts and demographics and all of that. But for myself, I know that in, as much as I'm doing the work to, doing the work within the vision of the academy, and I'm lucky to have had really exceptional training at Harvard and Duke. That's ridiculous. Um, but I'm also, and I say this to my family, I am also very keenly aware that I'm 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 doing the work for them, for my people, I'm doing it to make my family proud. I want to be as smart as they are. Um, and even if they don't have PhDs, um, I still trust their genius, and learned I've learned phenomenology from them. And so when I think about even my own position as an academic in Black studies, I've increasingly realized that, I'm not just inhabiting this role of professor that the Enlightenment University authorized. This is the role of the griot. This is the role of being a keeper of a culture, of of doing the work that, folks like Barbara Christian and Hortense Spillers did to cultivate a language that could recognize what writers like Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou were doing, because that wasn't getting recognized, because that was being misunderstood by an academy that was monolithic and I'll say monochromatic. So I've become newly reinvested in the importance of doing this work. Now, I don't think this is the only place to do this work, but I do think being a keeper of culture, which also means sharing the culture and respecting it and explicating how complex, innovative, beautiful, devastating, all of the things, human it is a really significant part of our work that we just have to carry forward.
And I think, thinking about the origins of the field and what what made the founding of Black Studies have to happen, sometimes in the case of Cornell, like at the point of a gun, is
Mm.
because the sources that were going to provide that wisdom, as you said, we're coming from places that have been so disparaged, right? And so it's like what Black Studies brings into the classroom and brings into scholarship as sites of wisdom, sites of insight, Black forms of knowing. Um, I think that's one of the real challenges of the institutionalization of the field is now we do have conventional forms of scholarship, and many of us have contributed to that. But then the question is always, you know, everything you were just saying, is that one of those moments where that broadest and deepest sense of community, right, of a particular kinds of knowing and traditions of speech and expressive culture, do they get left behind because of our, generations of analysis? Right? So I really like this way you talked about it as shifting as you said, shifting your position from scholar to griot. I think that's a sort of shift or complication is a really important nuance.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, something I've noticed is that the folks who cast the greatest doubt around Black studies, and this applies, I think, to other area studies or identitarian studies, are the folks who have not read a lick of it, right? So if we do nothing else,
Yes, it's really bad.
if we do nothing else, it's to say, I don't need to rehearse this because Ida B. Wells already did that work. W.B. Du Bois already did that work. Cedric Robinson already wrote that book, right? We have the benefit of and the privilege of building upon knowledge.
Yeah, no, I love that. Well put. And yeah, it's a little triggery when you say people have the strong feelings about Black studies who haven't read a single of the books. Yeah, I mean, but we have to know how to struggle against that because that's where most of the critiques come from.
Yes. And without wasting our time, as Toni Morrison says, the primary point of racism is distraction. So I also think that
yes,
a big part of Black studies and a big part of that getting free is getting clear on what it is what are we called to do, rather than being in service to an institution or, right, finding one's purpose. And fortunately for me, this aligns with my purpose.
So let me ask you a little bit about, I mean, I think in some ways you've already responded to this question, but I'll ask it anyway. Your PhD, I wrote you and I said your PhD is in English, but the literature program at Duke is just, you've already talked about it. I mean, it's kind of hard to talk about it as a disciplinary English PhD, but it is a quasi-discipline. I mean, close enough. But since then, your work has really moved, largely in Black studies, but also American studies and women, gender, sexuality studies. And so I'm interested to hear you talk about how that, somewhat disciplinary training, but then sort of scholarly and teacherly life in multi or anti-disciplinary studies, how you think that's impacted both how you imagine and execute research projects, but also how you put together a classroom.
Well, that is a not small question. I think one way of addressing that is to say, and something that I got from Duke, because I didn't come out of a Black Studies program, and there are a few Black Studies PhD programs. So my journey is different, and it's wonderful that you have this podcast that you talk to a number of people who can articulate multiple journeys. But mine kind of came through post-structuralism and cultural studies. I've decided fairly recently that I'm just going to say it, even though it's not been in vogue to actually name particularly theoretical models. That's what it is. And so I have been abidingly interested in what's called semiotics, paying attention to signs. I'm interested in how cultures and communities make meaning, circulate meaning. This is also something that Stuart Hall and the Black British Cultural Studies or the British Cultural Studies School endorses. So what I've been interested, or what I think is consistent in my work, is an attempt to get down to brass tacks, as it were, in terms of thinking about how is the concept of Blackness circulating? How does it circulate beyond any kind of one-to-one correspondence? How does it circulate as an aspirational idea? How does it circulate as an abjected idea? How does it circulate as a cultural practice? And for whom and when and under what conditions? So, history and context and medium are always at the forefront of my inquiry and examination. And in terms of constituting classes, I'm really interested in thinking together about what might be called Black theory or Black ways of knowing. Um, I'm thinking about, you know, Frantz Fanon's doing existentialism as well as psychoanalysis, but the Black version, right? It necessarily changes. W.B. Du Bois is doing continental philosophy, but the Black version. He's literally taken Kant and Hegel to task really explicitly with their conceptions of absolutes that we get through the Romantic era. I kind of, it's maybe somewhat arrogant of me, but I think of myself as operating in that vein, which I like to think of as an appropriately, I don't know if you want to say hybrid or an appropriately Black, because it's not just indigenous African. I can understand and trace the elements that have carried across the transatlantic slave trade, or also enduring African American conceptions of community, relationships to land, relationships to ideas of justice and self-determination. I'm interested in classrooms in not just presenting objects for my students and myself to examine that are ostensibly Black. So a Spike Lee film, but I'm interested in saying, okay, what makes this Black? Which aligns with some questions that are being posed really robustly and importantly in Black film studies, which is disaggregating the image from the actual. It's not sociology. So let's talk about representation. So I'm interested in not just the objects, but what are the tools and how can we cultivate the tools? And the tools can come from multiple places. They can and they must, I think, come from Black traditions of knowledge, and they're also informed by other, say, non-Black traditions of knowledge. And to the extent that Blackness has always been present, and this is what Toni Morrison tells us in the gorgeous book, Playing in the Dark, those studies are also informed by Blackness, whether they acknowledge them or not.
Mm-hmm. I love that. As a Caribbean studies specialist too, this question of, what does it mean to have these be a crossroads of the world and think about what is distinctive about your mode of knowing or analysis or being or as Creolism.
Yeah, that's Sylvia Wynter, right? And interestingly, not probably accidental that Sylvia Wynter, a Caribbean scholar herself, is really calling into question the entire foundation of principles of the world and of the human that are not just rooted in Europe, but are founded on an idea of the Black subject.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love teaching Sylvia Wynter. She's her work is so trendy in the minds of my grad students. They're always a little sobered up by how difficult she is to read and how if I assign a Sylvia Wynter essay, it might be 95 pages long. I think about all the word counts. I think about all the word counts we're bound to, and they gave her some leeway, thankfully. Well, let me ask you, not back up, but to widen the scope a little bit and ask you about how you think about what the history of Black studies, what the field of Black studies has done well, but also what you think maybe it hasn't done particularly well.
I think it's really wild to me that some folks are kind of over Black studies because I feel like we've just begun. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Black studies and other intentional studies of racial heritages and identities is being declared obsolete now that the scholars who inhabit those identities occupy the universities. Um, I I think that one of the great legacies of Black studies is to move away from a kind of an essentialist way of knowing. That and um, that's a part of what has happened as a consequence, I think, of people being invested in Black studies and also identified as Black in the academy, to understand that it's not that Black people are not a monolith, that there's a lot, there's an incredible diversity, and to and so I'm encouraged by the ways in which Black studies, and I think Fred Moten is one of the folks who does this particularly well, are encouraging holding in abeyance the idea of what it means to be Black, to think of it as fugitive or fleeting or ephemeral or conditional, and kind of coming back to what I said about to Black for whom, under what circumstances, when, and where. So, yeah. Yeah.
So let me ask you then about the idea that Black studies is obsolete 50 something years later is kind of wild to me. But this is what we contend with every day. And that's, I think, an interesting segue into this question about, what if we imagine a future of Black studies, what would be the sort of ultimate signifier or index of its success? And I ask this in this way. I think we can say that Black studies has had an enormous impact on disciplines. I think especially English and history departments, I think are unimaginable without Black studies, in the sense that, Black literature, whether it's diasporic or African American, Black history, Black Atlantic history and history departments, it's just part of what those disciplines mean these days, with increasing intensity and scope. And so is the ultimate success of Black studies in the future, I mean, a futurist kind of mode here, to have so transformed the disciplines that we really don't need Black studies, right? That it transforms the disciplines, and it already has, and that's a sign of its success when it has, in that sense, completely overhauled. To say, as you said before, that even these European traditions, which think of themselves as European traditions, were always obsessed with Blackness, right? So even everything is saturated with the Black studies question. Or is the ultimate sign of the success of Black studies that there is something about our field that lies at its center, at its foundation, at its core, that can never be redistributed to other disciplines, so that really Black studies, in its articulation of itself, has a kind of precision, obviously flexibility too. Every discipline has flexibility, but has a kind of stability to it that just can't be absorbed. And our articulation of that in the coming decades is actually more a sign of our success.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question, such an important one. And I would say, I think earlier in my career and in my life, I would have subscribed to the the first version that you offer, which, could be perceived as a kind of liberal integrationist project. All right, that the goal is to render this obsolete. And maybe that's still ultimately the goal. But I do believe that we're much further off from that future than I once thought we were. Um, because it's become increasingly apparent to me that um, what Black studies authorizes is a disposition towards study, whether that object that is being studied is conspicuously Black or not. But to the extent that we invoke the language of discipline in a kind of Foucaultian, kind of brutalist sense, but that it means that it has some bounds, that it means that one is taught, one learns a structure of thinking that is very specific to Black studies. I think that we will be needing Black studies for a very long time to come. if for no other reason, and there are other reasons, but if for no other reasons, then history continues to be created. So to think quite locally and to give an example, I've I've been emotionally and mentally occupied by the fires that raged in Pacific Palisades, but particularly in Altadena, which has a really significant historical Black population that was defined by redlining, um, and that so much grew out of it. And they're on the precipice of they've begun to archive, right? They've begun to archive the significance of what Black Altadena is, what impact that racially distinct community or that community of Black folks has meant and done for and in Southern California and the LA region. It's Black study that would discipline us into asking some of the crucial questions about who lives where, um, what are the family archives, who are the families who live there, where did they come from, when did they migrate here, what industries were they working in, how did they accrue generational wealth, what are their holdings? What are their individual archives? And I think that is what Black studies trains us to examine and to be able to talk about. Not just we're not at the point yet where criticism itself is sufficiently integrated to have a one size fits all lens to examine everything. Um, so I see Black studies as necessarily abiding for a good long while. And I, if I had a wish list, I would say that I would like to see, and I'm glad to see, increasing work on cultivating Black studies methodologies. What does the criticism look like? What does the analysis look like? Not just what are the objects. That work is important too, not just the archive, but what does it mean to examine a past or a present or a future? Octavia Butler is from Altadena. Paying attention to the way that Black life, and particularly in the United States, but we can extend this globally if we think about resource extractions, if we think about the drive towards genocides, what 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 the world looks like from a structurally, not individually, but a structurally Black point of view.
I love that. That's extremely well put. And this question of, what is a Black Studies methodology, or what are the collections of methodologies, um, and the way you concluded that, what does it look like structurally from a Black point of view? I mean, these are, I never think of these as shortcomings of the field, because it's not an old field. But these are the kind of questions I wonder, when are we going to have those anthologies, on,
Right.
debates around methodology? We have critical term, sort of encyclopedia kind of approaches. Of course, tons of object studies. That's a main driver of most scholarship. But this question of what are Black studies methodologies? I think that's such a crucial horizon for answering the question as you just put it there. So, yeah, thank you so much for that. That's very thoughtful. Um, and maybe this is already then a beginning of a response to my last question for you, which is, in a Black studies context, what is the issue you want us to all be thinking about, or the question you want us to all ask?
Well, quite selfishly, I want everyone to remember Altadena. It's going to take years to rebuild, if that is actually what's happening. Um, what's going to be happening there, much like what happened and is happening in New Orleans post Katrina, maybe not even that dissimilar to what happened to Greenwood Avenue in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to pay attention not just to the destruction of Black life, but to the the presence of Black community, the conceptions of Blackness that were and continue to be cared for and acknowledged. And um, I think, too, in a broader and again U.S. context, though arguably globally, with the return of a ideology that is invested in a very narrow vision of the past that invokes kind of liberal principles they're quite ready to leave Black folks, Black history, and others behind in pursuit of some kind of modern avant-garde future that that we that I think we really, really need to be on the lookout for that and to insist upon remembering. Lucille Clifton's poem, lines from her poem, Why Some People Be Mad at Me Sometime, rings in my ears so often these days. And she says, they ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories, and I keep on remembering mine. So I'd like for Black studies to keep remembering Blackness and Black folks and Black brilliance.
I love that. That is a fantastic place to conclude. Very very thoughtful and interesting conversation. So thank you so much for that. And this place to wrap up is just really profound. So I appreciate that. I appreciate your time through all of this, and I really love this as a place to yeah, to pull it. Really, this pulls so much of what you were talking about together. Thank you so much, Courtney. It's been really, really interesting. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this podcast. It's immeasurably valuable, and thank you for your time, and to the listeners as well.
Thank you. I'll pass that on to Ashley. We did this as a project. We hope that it would be interesting to people, and so I'm always happy when I hear that it is. All right. Well, have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Okay, take care.